Hi guys, now welcome to our first video on studied fiction, Animal Farm. So Animal Farm is our second novel. So we have to basically boil it down to about 7 or 8 different elements, and I'll be going through those over the next few weeks. And we can also compare and contrast Animal Farm then to our first novel, which is Noughts and Crosses. So hopefully you've done the revision on Noughts and Crosses. And hopefully you've read Animal Farm. If not, remember it's available on Audible and Kindle. I mean, I've had to rely on my Kindle version here because my own book, the actual book, is still in KH with all my notes and all my ideas still in it. So basically, when we're focusing on Animal Farm, we're going to be looking at genre, so the type of novel that it is. We're going to be looking at setting and characters. We'll also look at plot and themes. And then we can focus, of course, on analysing the opening of the novel, the ending of the novel, and choosing one dramatic episode. Now, to make it easier, we'll probably look at a dramatic episode in chapter 1, or the opening, or a dramatic episode in chapter 10, the ending. Okay, just to make sure that we're not kind of overburdening ourselves with too much work. So I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible and just make it more digestible and easier for you. Okay, so today what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on genre, setting and characters. Then I'll focus on some of the other aspects then in the next class, and we can launch straight into then our analysis of chapter 1. Okay. And as I'm going through, I'll make various references then to Noughts and Crosses, and we can see, of course, that there are some parallels. There are some, of course, similarities in terms of the two novels, but then there are quite marked and quite obvious differences between Noughts and Crosses and Animal Farm. So Noughts and Crosses, of course, is contemporary fiction, okay? It was published almost 20 years ago, and it focuses on a dystopian society. Okay, when we're looking at Animal Farm, it is what we call a classic novel. So it was published in 1945 and written by George Orwell, who's a very well-known, very prominent writer and journalist. So he was writing during the Second World War, so obviously that was going to influence his writing to a large extent. So we can see, of course, that first and foremost, when we're reading through the novel, that there's more to the novel than meets the eye. It's not just about the text, it's not just about the basic story about the animals overthrowing their oppressors, the humans, and then becoming corrupt, of course, on the power that they wield, obviously Napoleon and so on. It does, of course, relate back to politics at the time, and it's also considered, of course, a timeless and universal novel as well, because we can see sort of elements of today's society and today's political leaders and today's political systems in Animal Farm. Okay, so first of all, of course, when we think about it, Animal Farm is a short novel, so we call it a novella. Okay, a longer novel, obviously, of course, a novel, and then a short novel. It's only 10 chapters, and it's quite easy to read and quite easy then to digest. So 10 short chapters, a novella. The full title is Animal Farm, A Fairy Story. Now, when we think about a fairy story, we kind of think of something romantic, perhaps we'd say, something cozy and reassuring, something for children. But kind of think about it, a lot of fairy stories and fairy tales are actually very, very dark. So we could say, of course, that first and foremost, when we look at Animal Farm, A Fairy Story, it's quite misleading. Or we could say that it's quite ironic. Okay, because it's really a novel about brutality and about corruption and about violence and oppression as such here too. Okay, in Animal Farm we have 10 chapters. Obviously, of course, Noughts and Crosses, very different bite-sized chapters, and we have 117 in total. So it's a proper novel as opposed to just a short one being a novella. Okay, the genre itself. First of all, of course, we notice that it is a fable. Now, fable is a story, of course, involving animals. And the animals, of course, behave like human beings, and we all know that that obviously is anthropomorphism, okay? Where animals, of course, walk and talk, okay? Where they wear clothes, where they eat, where they interact, we'd say, like human beings. So this is a fable. And think about Aesop's fables, of course. They're very famous stories about animals behaving like human beings, and they always have an important moral or lesson to communicate or inculcate, which is to teach. So basically, this is a fable, of course, about animals overthrowing humans. But then we begin to realize, of course, that it has a political dimension, that it's not just about the animals, of course, being corrupted by power. It's about human nature and humans being corrupted by power. We can also say, of course, that it's an example of dystopian fiction like Noughts and Crosses, because it deals with inequality, discrimination, violence, and oppression. It creates a kind of a nightmarish scenario, essentially, for the animals, and the animals try to improve their lot and improve, of course, and better their society, and then they end up, of course, right back at square one at the very end of the novel itself. It is also then an allegory. So that's Allegory. So an allegory is a story that reveals a hidden meaning or message. Okay, so think about it, the idea that it's a fable first and foremost, that it's an example of dystopian fiction, and then it's an allegory. So quite a lot of what happens is kind of metaphorical then. There's the text and then there's the subtext. There's a nice little story about animals which turns dark, and then there's a subtext which really focuses, of course, on politics, on society, on human behaviour, on corruption, on power, and so on. It is also what we call a satire. Remember when we were doing base details, we had Siegfried Sassoon, who was ridiculing the majors. It was kind of caricature, of course, of the obese majors who were arrogant and selfish. Here, of course, it's emphasizing particular figures throughout human history, or particular countries or states or systems throughout human history, essentially, which have or who have behaved badly. So it's ridiculing human behavior. Sometimes it's ridiculing human society. Okay, we can see that George Orwell is targeting religion, for example, organized religion, and he's also targeting, of course, not just politicians, but particular types of systems, political systems as well. So the key one would be totalitarianism. Now, it sounds like a lot, totalitarianism, but basically all it means is that the state seizes full control and the state oppresses the ordinary person, the ordinary individual, as part of that society. Okay, so the state then dictates how the ordinary people should behave or even think, essentially, as well. So if we think about examples of totalitarian states, I mean, the obvious one would be Nazi Germany then, Hitler's rise to power in the early 1930s, and then all the way to 1945. Okay, in this particular book, a lot of people are saying, of course, that George Orwell is focusing on Stalin and Russia. Okay, and that would be, of course, from the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 right up, of course, to the end of Stalin's rule then in the 1950s. Okay, so what he's doing is he's focusing on quite a lot of the events and episodes, of course, in that particular part of Russian history. And then we can see the parallels between that and then what happens to the animals and the humans in Animal Farm. Okay, so in a way, of course, there is a hidden or subtle meaning then, of course, as opposed to just a straightforward story or tale or fairy story, as he mentioned. Okay, so we have the idea of a fable, we have the idea of dystopian fiction, an allegory, and a satire. So those are our four key terms then when we're looking at the genre as such. Now, think about it, of course, obviously Mallory Blackman is doing something quite similar when it comes to Noughts and Crosses, in that she, of course, is highlighting systematic and institutional racism in her book Noughts and Crosses. Okay, so she's focusing on discrimination suffered by the Noughts, and the Noughts are supposed to represent, of course, Black and Asian people in our world and how they're discriminated against, and she's emphasizing, of course, the inequality then which undermines our society and our quest for happiness and freedom. Okay, think about, of course, the difference is then when it comes to Noughts and Crosses, it's also a Bildungsroman or coming of age tale and an example of young adult fiction. I mean, back in the 1940s, that really didn't exist in terms of a genre, essentially young adult fiction. You just basically had books and people just read them whatever age they were. So basically it has sort of like children's fiction and then adults fiction. Okay, there wasn't that kind of middle ground, essentially then, we'd say fiction that was created or written specifically for teenagers. So remember that a Bildungsroman, of course, emphasizes the early years and the formative years of the main character. And we have two characters, of course, Callum and Seffi. Okay, so that's genre then, basically, in terms of Animal Farm itself. And the title is self-explanatory. When we're reading the book, of course, we come to realise that Animal Farm then, of course, is this kind of utopian idea, a perfect idea then that is created by the animals. Old Major then, of course, decides that the oppressors need to be overthrown, and that the name of Manor Farm then, of course, is changed in chapter 2 to Animal Farm. Okay, so basically the setting itself, very straightforward. It's the English countryside. Okay, and we can see at the very beginning it's quite idyllic or pretty or picturesque. But then the further we read into chapter 1, then, of course, we see that it's actually a very grim place. It's very dark and very oppressive for the animals. It's quite corrupt, of course, because we can see then that the human characters, in particular, Mr. Jones and Mrs. Jones, neglect their duties to the animals. So the farm itself, then, we come to realise actually represents a particular country or a particular state. So we can say that Manor Farm comes to represent then Russia or Russian society before the Workers' Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So who was in charge? We had Tsar, rather like a king, of course. So that was Tsar Nicholas. And he essentially then was overthrown by the ordinary people, who rebelled against the fact, of course, that he was quite indulgent and selfish and arrogant, and that they had nothing, whereas he had everything. Okay, so in a way then Nicholas is represented by Farmer Jones. Okay, and then the animals represent the ordinary workers then, essentially, who decide to overthrow then the dictator or despot or tyrant. And that really is where the theme comes into play as well, because it's about power and corruption then. Right, so if we're focusing then on the characters, obviously the characters then come to represent and symbolise real people, okay, and the events come to represent real events and circumstances. But if we just keep it quite simple to begin with, so we'll focus on Mr. Jones. So Mr. Jones is the owner or proprietor then of the farm, Manor Farm. Now, if you think of Manor Farm itself, just relating back to setting, it does suggest, of course, obviously that it's an independent farm, and perhaps it's a large farm, because if you think of a manor, of course, it's usually a large house, essentially, a domain or an estate. The idea of a mansion, perhaps, is implied here. So that would suggest, of course, a kind of well-to-do couple then, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who own this particular farm. And manor would suggest kind of lord of the manor. So perhaps, of course, this was once part of the estate or an estate itself. Okay, so Mr. Jones then, of course, is neglectful, irresponsible and cruel. Those are the three key words. So make sure that you're jotting down the key words as we're going along that we associate with genre, setting, and then characters. So Mr. Jones, the key words again, neglectful, irresponsible, and cruel. Okay, so in chapter 1, he's drunk. He comes home drunk, essentially, and he doesn't secure then the gates and fences and doors around the farm. So we can see, of course, that the animals go hungry quite a lot of the time. They're actually underfed and they're neglected, they're not taken care of, essentially. So that relates back then to Tsar Nicholas then, the second of Russia, who is basically neglecting his duty as a leader and just suiting himself or satisfying himself. So we see then Mr. Jones as a drunkard or an alcoholic, and he becomes not just that, not just a neglectful farmer, but he becomes, of course, a tyrant as well. He's actually quite cruel towards the animals. So it's not just neglecting the animals, but it's actually abusing the animals. Okay, chapter 2, of course, outlines that neglect then. You have the idle farmhands who are not actually doing the proper work, looking after the animals or even looking after the farm. You have the fields that are full of weeds, for example. Everything is overgrown, essentially, there, and everything is quite shabby and dilapidated looking. And as I said, then the animals are underfed. So this is kind of the hungry working classes then in Russia who didn't have enough food to eat. Okay. Mrs. Jones, on the other hand, then, is a kind of like a shadowy figure. She doesn't really feature that prominently. Her clothes are mentioned now and again. She's mentioned at the very beginning in chapter 1, just kind of lying in bed, snoring away when her husband comes back then from the pub. So she is kind of neglectful as well, but she's sort of oblivious. She doesn't even pay any attention to the animals. She doesn't pay any attention to the farm. She kind of suits herself again. So once more, the kind of selfishness and the superficial aspect, perhaps we say, of Serena would be suggested there too. Okay, even think of Mr. Jones's name. It's a kind of generic name, Mr. Jones. It's like Mr. Smith. He's the kind of everyman, essentially. He's sort of faceless, really. There's nothing very distinctive about him. He just becomes kind of representative of that particular ruling class who then oppress the ordinary workers or the working class. It's quite a bland name when you think about Mr. Jones and then Mrs. Jones. So we don't get to hear an awful lot about them. It's more about who they represent or what they represent in terms of that. And remember, of course, that Tsar Nicholas was eventually overthrown by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution of 1917. And he was imprisoned, first of all, then he was exiled, and he was actually shot. Okay, so he was killed, of course, as a result of his behaviour. Now, I just want to make a quick reference then to the other humans and the other farms in the surrounding area. So we have Foxwood Farm. Okay, so Foxwood Farm then is owned and run by Mr. Pilkington. Okay, and we see that Mr. Pilkington then, of course, is very suspicious of the pigs when they take over the running of Animal Farm in chapter 2. But then by the end, of course, he is busy socialising with them in chapter 10. So Mr. Pilkington then and Foxwood have a parallel in real life. So Foxwood is supposed to represent the UK during the 1940s and 50s and America as well. And sort of the idea that they were dealing with Russia, but they weren't really focusing on the problems within Russia. They were ignoring the fact that Joseph Stalin, was a brutal dictator. So you could say that Mr. Pilkington then would represent the Prime Minister of Great Britain at that particular time, who was Winston Churchill. Okay, he was Prime Minister from 1940 to 1945, and then from 1951 to 1955. And the American president then, who ruled from 1933 to 45, was FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Okay, so the UK and the US then, they were allies, obviously, during the Second World War. But it's kind of the idea that Russia, of course, was fighting on their side during the Second World War, but they were ignoring all of the brutality that was happening under the regime then of Stalin himself. Okay, so Mr. Pilkington, of course, is a little bit like Mr. Jones, and he just sort of suits himself. He doesn't really care about animal welfare. He doesn't really care about the proper running of the farm as such, as long as it makes money for him. Okay, so the selfishness and the greed, of course, and the vanity of the human characters emerge very quickly at the very beginning of Animal Farm. Okay, number 3 then. Okay, so we have Mr. Jones Farm, obviously Manor Farm. Then we have Foxwood Farm, run by and owned by Mr. Pilkington. Number 3 is Pinchfield Farm. Okay, and that is owned and run by Mr. Frederick. So Pinchfield is supposed to represent Germany, specifically Nazi Germany, of course, during the 1930s and 40s. So that makes perfect sense here again. So Mr. Frederick, then, when you think about it, is supposed to represent Adolf Hitler, who's Chancellor, of course, of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. So we can see, of course, that obviously during the 1930s, they were trying to appease Hitler, essentially. A lot of them, of course, they didn't really understand how dangerous he was, how volatile he was. And it's almost like trying to micromanage him, essentially, before realizing then, of course, what a brutal dictator and mass murderer he actually was. Okay, so there we have the 3 farms and then the 3 human characters established at the very beginning. Okay, so we'll just leave it there for today, right? So that is Monday's class then. If you have any questions, you can email me, or you can pose the questions, obviously, or post them just underneath this particular video, and I'll get back to you either straight away if they're posted here, or I'll get back to you then, just a little time lapse when it comes to the emails. So for the next class then, which is obviously on Tuesday morning, I will focus on the animals, on the characters and the characteristics then that we associate with them. So in the meantime, make sure that you're keeping up to date with your reading, and make sure, of course, that you're memorizing the key points relating to genre, setting, and characters as we're going along. So take it in a very methodical way. Be organized. Okay, remember you can view these videos as many times as you like. You can stop and start them after the first time that you view them, of course, which is during class time, and you view them straight through. Okay, so you can email me at any time then if you wish to ask a question or if you have a query. So see you next time, guys.